Dear friends of the American Hellenic Chamber of Commerce, welcome to another session of our Sustainable Talks. One thing is for sure, this will be a year to remember. With so many lives being lost or torn apart from the pandemic side effects, optimism is hard to find. But then again, in a year that is so painful, so frightening, and so uncomfortable, there is a drive that pushes societies to rediscover basic human values. And this drive towards a new and better normality cannot be ignored by business. Here at AmCham, we have a solid record of promoting values-driven and purpose-driven business as an unquestionable contemporary standard for corporations that not only understand the critical issues of sustainability, economic, social, environmental, related to their operation, but also walk the extra mile for addressing challenges of global proportions for the common benefit of the people and the planet. Within this context, the work of AmCham's Corporate Responsibility Committee sheds light onto contemporary business strategies and practices that connect business with societal purpose, that connect business with a global vision for sustainability. Our position papers, our conferences, and focused events, such as today's discussion, aspire to inspire business leaders for a new level of collaboration and commitment in the Greek business community. Pharmaceutical business, one of the fastest growing and most influential business sectors in the world, does not need to search for a societal purpose. It is already built in the business model, in the products and services they provide, health and well-being of mankind. Amid the colossal pandemic crisis, this purpose is more crucial than it will ever be. Today's discussion will focus on the fascinating subject of the future of medicine and its social impact, elaborating on the multidimensional ties between health and prosperity. We will look at challenges and breakthroughs under the pressure of a worldwide health crisis. We will look at the value of collaboration among pharma companies for the benefit of life-essential discovery. We will look at scientific advancements that drive societal growth on a global scale. I would like to thank the valued member of our chamber, AbbVie, for sponsoring this event, and our communication sponsors, CNN Greece and nonmed.gr. I would also like to thank our Corporate Responsibility Committee for their continuous drive and innovative spirit. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Thomas Hudson, Senior Vice President R&D and Chief Scientific Officer at AbbVie. The discussion will be moderated by Vasiliki Angouridi, Managing Editor of newsforhealth.gr. Ms. Angouridi, it's over to you.
I would like to welcome everyone, hello, to our discussion today, which focuses on the complex and bidirectional relationship between pharma research and prosperity amidst the global pandemic, which tests the endurance of health systems, economies, and societies and presses the need for fast access to safe and effective vaccines and medicine. To help us navigate through the discussion on the future of medicine, the lessons we are learning during this global health crisis, and the ways that science and society can strengthen their relationship is Dr. Hudson. Dr. Hudson is Senior Vice President of Research and Development and Chief Scientific Officer of AbbVie. He leads the company's R&D organization and a global team of scientists who work across therapeutic areas to identify potential new treatments for a variety of diseases. Prior to joining AbbVie, Dr. Hudson was the President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Institute for Cancer, a pioneer in mapping the human genome. Dr. Hudson is internationally renowned for his work in genomics, human genome variation, and genetic diseases. We will start with a presentation from Dr. Hudson on the future of pharma research. Dr. Hudson, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for the invitation. I'm just going to say a couple of things about myself. I'm a clinical immunologist. I'm a Canadian. I've been in the US for 4 years working at AbbVie, but my career actually went back and forth between US and Canada. Although I'm a clinical immunologist, studied and treated patients with asthma, allergies, lupus, many different autoimmune diseases. Most of my career was actually my career started in the US mapping the human genome during the Human Genome Project. That was at MIT. I was very fortunate to lead a group of technologists, but also biologists, to map, again, 25 years ago was actually our big paper on the map of the human genome, which was preceded the sequencing of the human genome as part of that Human Genome Project. But the rest of my career, a lot of it's been applications that were first identifying genes that cause disease for rare diseases, rare pediatric diseases, but also common diseases, asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, colon cancer, susceptibility to infections such as leprosy, so many different things. I have a couple of slides. I don't know if we can just put the slide on. Again, I just wanted to say that my career has been in academia, but I joined the company 4 years ago, first to build oncology, discovery of new cancer genes, new targets, do early clinical trials. We went from a very small oncology franchise to something that's quite large and very proud of 4 years later. And the last year, I've actually been taking over all of aspects of research and development, goes from discovery, development, clinical trials, medical affairs. So we have about 11,000 scientists and clinicians around the world supporting some of our programs. The next slide. So I have to start with the pandemic because, in fact, my world as in my new role changed very quickly because of this, because of the pandemic. AbbVie is known for its work in virology. We have drugs in HIV. We have drugs for hepatitis C, and we actually had one drug called Kaletra, which had been shown, at least in some small studies, to actually be effective during the SARS infection, goes back about 15 years, and a little bit in the other coronavirus infection called MERS. So here, all of a sudden, we had a new pandemic with coronavirus. People thought that this might be a drug. Actually, we started working, supporting research groups in China, but then Europe, then the rest of the world, to actually find whether Kaletra worked. In fact, most of those collaborations were not with pharma. They were with physicians, clinical networks, and very importantly, the World Health Organization, which wanted to know very quickly whether it would work or not. And they and some other networks actually did some large-scale studies, did not show that Kaletra worked. And it wasn't a surprise in a sense that when you generate an antiviral drug, you spend a lot of time and years making that perfect molecule to bind to that perfect protein and block its activity. And Kaletra wasn't developed for COVID, but there had been, again, some experiments and some clinical results which made us think it might work. More importantly, I started working with world leaders and with other pharma leaders in developing new therapies, new antibodies that could actually bind very specifically to the antibody, being a form of treatment, and new antivirals. And as I said, it can take several years, but we also realized, we should have been prepared. We had 2 coronavirus infections in the last 15 years. It was very likely that another one would come. And at this point, we're kind of thinking not being prepared just for COVID-19, but for future pandemics. How can we generate the tools so we can have drugs available to patients and families and people around the world whenever it comes? So it's not just about a short-term gain. It's actually generating drugs that are actually effective against the viruses like coronaviruses, which actually are leading to pandemics. This collaboration, I'll call more during the question and now the Q&A a bit later, certainly involved myself with all the other research leaders from other companies, but within our companies, multiple groups working together on how to make more effective clinical trials, new assays. We use screening labs in Europe to actually test some existing compounds we had in our libraries to rapidly see which ones could be seeds for new programs. Much of collaboration. The next slide. This slide actually is despite the pandemic, we still have work to do. First of all, we still have drugs to bring to patients around the world in oncology, in immunology, in virology. We still have Kaletra to bring to 800,000 HIV patients. So there's a lot of work to do. And in my organization, discovery needs to happen. We did take people out of labs, and we had to create protocols to get them back to the labs and safely set up some testing and so on. We continued our trials. Most of our trials continued, but new trials were actually paused for several months before we restarted. And then medical affairs, we generally have physicians that work with physicians within our company in medical affairs work with physicians in clinical sites around the world to actually talk about new drugs, talk about studies. And all of that was paused when it was very difficult. We use more internet tools to actually have those interactions. It's not the same thing, but actually we had to cope like everybody else. But still, there's a need for not just developing drugs for the pandemic, but for many other diseases. The next slide. Being a child of the Human Genome Project, I can't not talk about genomics, but the reason I brought it here is it's one of the two topics I thought we'd discuss this morning, is how drug discovery and development has changed because of genomics. Initially, we mapped the genome, we started doing studies of patients with disease to identify mutations that cause disease, help us better understand diseases themselves, and eventually lead to identify also new targets, which could be used for drugs, and identify the right patient for the drug, for each drug, and that's called precision medicine or personalized medicine, depending which country you're in. But it's actually really a way of moving away from thinking that everybody with the same symptoms, similar syndrome actually have disease for the same reason, and that we should treat them all the same way. You know, there was a day when even fever was considered diseases before antibiotics and before thermometers. People thought they were a disease. Eventually, we understood there's multiple types of infections can cause fever, multiple inflammation, even cancer can cause fever in some patients. So there's many causes. It's the same thing for diabetes, which is elevated blood sugar, hypertension, elevated blood pressure. And it's the same thing for tumors, because I've done a lot of cancer genomics. Not every patient who has the same disease actually has it for the same reason. And more, we want to treat the cause. Just as you do in infections, you want to go after the right microbe with the right antibiotic. Here we want to get the right drug that actually is specific for a patient's disease. So the thinking of medicine, the thinking of what's actually causing disease has been expanded because of genomics, the ability to look at, again, which genes in the body are predispose a person to disease, but also within a disease tissue, looking at the disease cells, again, using genomics to see which genes are turned on or off, gives an idea on how to treat. It also makes sure that we try to get the right drug to the patient by looking at a patient's tissues. We do this a lot in oncology, but it's happening more and more in other areas. The next slide. Actually, the Human Genome Project means that I've been working in big data all my life. The first genome was big, and now we have millions of genomes, which are sequenced around the world. So it took 10 years for the first genome, but we do some every day. We even have projects which we sequence the genomes or which genes are turned on in every cell in a tumor. We're not just looking at the tumor cells, we're looking at what's happening in immune cells and in the fibroblasts and so on. We start understanding the interactions between different cells, and actually that is often a cause of resistance to drug. So we understand, so that generates huge data, a genome for every cell in a tumor. The same thing, we go look at entire populations of patients. We're interested in where patients come from, what are the disease, what are the symptoms, the genomes, the genetics, when we can have access to that data. But ultimately the outcome, which could be efficacy, response to drug, but also the non-response to drug is also very important. And I'll come back again during the discussion, but it takes a lot of data. So what's written on this slide is more about the technologies, distributed computing and data science, artificial intelligence, analytics. What I'm more interested in is actually what do we use this for? It goes back to understanding the disease, understanding the gene targets, designing drugs that are specific to disease processes that we think are much more linked to the disease, and then matching that drug to the right patient. So again, the technology enables us to do medicine in a different way, medical development, clinical development, but also the applications of medicines are changing very quickly. And as we generate data, there's always more things to be identified through the data than your original question. So it's actually continues to grow. It's a growing knowledge that's coming from these large data sets. the last slide, I want to say the word partnership. The way we do drug discovery and development today is very different. Maybe 20 years ago, you would think of a drug discovery company, a drug development company, would be huge labs located somewhere with thousands of people. But we still have that because we're manufacturing drugs and so on. But in fact, most of the research, the discovery and the clinical research is done outside the headquarters, is done through networks. Even if I have 1,000 people doing discovery in oncology and immunology, there's many more people thinking about these problems in the rest of the world, in universities, in small companies, in biotechs. And it's very important for us to reach out. So the model of industry has moved from doing everything to do with everything within the company to doing a lot of the discovery and the work external to the company, both again working with academic centers, small companies, but also clinical trials in clinical sites around the world. So partnership is really important. And AbbVie being a new company since it split from Abbott about 7 years ago, a lot of our growth is actually building up these networks around the world. So I'm going to stop here with the slides and we can go with some questions at this point.
So before we begin, I would like to invite our viewers to submit any questions they may have on the live media platform. Dr. Hudson, you talked about research and how the model has changed, but societal needs have guided scientific research in general and more so in the field of medicine. And COVID-19 is a perfect example of that. It has reshaped the research agenda at warp speeds, bringing to the forefront the symbiotic relationship between public health and prosperity, sustainability. Is there a new paradigm emerging?
Yeah, I mean, I could say I saw it everywhere. Right away, people were on the phone calling heads of R&D, scientists calling for each other companies, how we can move together. I even had companies telling me, hey, your drug works here, you know, a competitor company telling me my drug worked in their assay. That was kind of not something I've heard before. So, and it happened very quickly. First of all, you have to remember many of them are physicians, and we ourselves, because I have some clinicians which went back to work in hospitals, or families or others are already involved. And of course, we have brothers and sisters, we have parents which have been sick. So everyone is involved. We're all in this together. The race is, of course, we didn't know and still don't know how bad it's going to get. But there is a need for, there's a big medical need right now, and a societal need. It's not just, you know, the whole economy. So many things are suffering. Some people have difficulties. It's very important for us to not waste time. No red tape. Reach out. If you want a collaboration, you do it. You don't need to write a materials research agreement or a contract. You just share the data. That happened very quickly. The other thing that I noticed is that it was a free-for-all. Everybody wanted to test every drug that they had in their pipeline against patients, and some of those drugs have side effects, and some of them have not been developed for COVID. Yet everybody wanted to move so quickly. Actually, I learned a lot working with my colleagues how other companies were dealing with the situation, how they were learned to prioritize, how then we learned it's not about my pipeline or your pipeline, it's how do we find the drugs that work the best. Sometimes we have drugs in the same pathway, and you could think we wouldn't want to compete. We agreed, well, let's just test one. If it works, we'll tell the others, and then we'll figure out which one's the best. So a lot of changes have happened at that level. And as I'm moving, so I'm actually very involved in what's called a pandemic preparedness. It's actually be preparing for the next pandemic. And we're using genomics to identify for all the microbes which we think could be involved, all the important proteins of the virus that are used for viral application, and how do we make a small molecule or an antibody against each of them is actually work we're starting. So this is a long-term endeavor, not just something that's going to be for a year. My company doesn't do vaccines. I mean, you don't start things you don't do, but we're very good in antivirals. We've done, again, drugs for HIV and drugs for hepatitis C. So we know how to make drugs for antiviruses. So that's an area that we actually built, but not doing it by ourselves, doing it in partnerships with other companies.
Mm-hmm. So the pandemic has changed the relationship status in the industry itself. I mean we see pharmaceutical companies stopped racing to outpace each other, and they started, gathering forces. You decided to gather forces. Is that an innate trait that comes out in critical times, or will synergies be the standard from here on out?
There's some things of collaboration which has been growing over the years, so it's not new that companies and partners like the Wellcome Trust or the NIH or the European Medicines Agency actually have partnerships. It's actually something that's happening more and more, but we often call it pre-competitive. We don't understand lupus. We don't understand what's the right biomarker for immunotherapy. It's not really about developing the drug, but there's things we need to do together. And also, if we develop different biomarkers for different drugs, how is the physician or the patient going to know which one, the right one to apply if the biomarkers are tested in different ways? So creating standards is something that we've been doing a lot more. I have to say one place that was very helpful is the companies wanted to start sharing safety data. And because very often the side effects that happen from drugs are so rare, you only see once or twice in a clinical trial. You don't know for sure whether it's actually, when you see it, whether it's caused by the drug or not. But if pharma companies share safety information, and we start seeing that with the same class of drugs, even from different companies, we're starting to see the side effect happen more often. We had these signals earlier. We created a database. I've been working for several years called Data Accelerate. The partnership is called Transcelerate, but the Data Accelerate is about creating a database so we could share safety data. And lo and behold, just when it's ready, COVID comes along, and we needed to share data. So actually, we had a mechanism. It had not existed. It could have taken us a year to get it up and running. So it's very fortunate that we had a pathway. It was still, I would say, in terms of collaboration, baby steps. Right now, we have to do it. Okay. And I think that some of those tools are going to continue. And I'm looking at sharing standards of patients. We see very often in clinical trials, you have patients called standard of care. Before you give a drug, some people are under the controls. Well, we can share that data. We all get to learn better about why people respond to standard of care or not. I know another company had talked to me about how about we share information on patients that never respond to any drug, because in many diseases we still don't have a drug. And we still put them on a drug that's 15, 20 years old, which nobody believes, and they don't respond anyway. What if we could actually identify upfront people which are not going to respond, and we're not going to subject them to standard of care? But that's a novel concept of sharing non-responders. So there are places where we see it. In my business, the most important thing I have to do every day is think unmet medical need. Because you're talking about societal needs, but there's a lot of needs in medicine. Even when there's a drug that works for a form of arthritis or Crohn's disease or something, there's many patients that don't respond. Why don't they respond? Is there a subgroup that need a different therapy? What's special about them? So many of my colleague companies are doing that. So understanding unmet medical need is something we need to do together. And very often we need to do with clinicians, not just the ones in the company, but the ones around the world. So that sustainability issue that you're so important, I think it comes from that level of partnership. Understand unmet medical need. There's still some race about making some drugs, but at least if we actually understand well the diseases that are affecting people, like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, for which no good treatments have come out, really for a long time. Why do that in competition? Why not understand the disease, and then we will use some competition around drugs eventually, but certainly accelerating the understanding of diseases, so things we can do more and more.
COVID is creating a legacy, that is obvious. But so cooperation between all stakeholders is one important factor. Sharing data and information is another one. Are we moving fast enough though? Could technological innovations, for example, such as AI or even smart health devices and mobile health applications, hold the key to accelerating scientific developments?
There's a lot. These are all big topics. In digital medicine, just apps that can measure when patients have a tremor due to Parkinson, as opposed to observing it or asking them scale 1 to 5. You can actually measure the tremor. Kids with atopic dermatitis, which are itchy, there's an app can actually measure that, and then you can know better whether the drug's responding or not. There's all types of tools which are being tested and used more and more just to kind of understand disease state. And then ultimately it's again for a better disease control for patients. There are there's I'll say first of all, because in genetics I learned this for 25 years, privacy is very important for people. But privacy, sometimes there's a reason to actually share information. And I saw it first in rare diseases, pediatric diseases, where there's a few cases in different countries, and physicians were collecting information on genetics, but wasn't sure which gene was mutated, which gene was responsible for what disorder the patient had. And we created something called Matchmaker, which just physicians could go on a website, put some genetic information, put some symptoms, and then actually two physicians in two parts of the world would actually understand, well, it could be linked and actually talk about it. And when that Matchmaker came out, within a year, there were publications, a whole issue of a journal was on diseases which are identified through this type of matchmaking. So privacy is important, but the patients and the families certainly didn't think that they had to keep everything locked up in a database. They wanted a way to actually share their information, to actually find other kids with the same information and potentially lead to better understanding of the disease, and that's what happened. So there's a fine line between privacy and sharing, but it's probably something we can learn to do responsibly.
If we moved the part of the clinical trial to real life, maybe we get more accurate results of how drugs, how the patients react to the drugs tested. So is that a way to go, by using applications and mobile phones and all that technology you talked about?
Yes. So we can do to traditional trials differently, but also called post trials, the time after trials, post marketing information using databases. For example, if we know that patients are not going to respond, I talked earlier, sometimes we know patients don't respond well to drugs, we can make synthetic control arms, as opposed to putting half the patients on a drug and half patients not on a drug, which they don't respond. We can actually go in a database of health information and identify 100 or 1,000 patients which are similar to the ones which are going to put on drug. And FDA and EMA have approved that. They approve because you're basically, it's taking less time. You're not subjecting patients to drug that doesn't work. And the cohort, your control comes from a database. You have to be very careful. You need very good information, but to actually make sure you match your patient population well. But so synthetic controls is one way to accelerate trial development. It decreases cost of development, but also, more importantly, more patients actually, you get really answers quickly on what works, and you're not subjected patient. More patients to standard of care. The other you talked is safety. We don't always know what safety signals will come out from a study. Even if we tested in hundreds or 1,000 patients, we may not pick up many of those rare events. So actually what we've created more is working with health authorities to actually share safety information. And even after a trial is finished, we can continue monitoring those patients using big data, and of course, as the drug is sold, there's ways that we now can collect information for safety. And that's actually, I think, a tremendous value for society.
So you talked about privacy. Is there in general like a dark side in accelerating science and technology besides privacy that needs to be carefully managed? People view it sometimes as a double-edged sword. We move too fast, we lose some things, such as privacy. Is it any other areas that we should keep an eye on when it comes to accelerating research?
Well, again, in my field of genetics and genomics, we've lived through those discussions for 25 years. Should we sequence the genome, the dignity? What does it mean to be human? Is it a piece of information in your DNA, or is it more than that? But more importantly, as we were sequencing the first genomes, we were very careful not to share that information. We were afraid some people might discover things from others. So we created tools to share data responsibly. You don't put, there's ways that different databases, just like your bank account, you go to a bank machine. Clearly, there's information on the internet which allows you to get matched to your account and get your dollars out. So there are mechanisms for data security which exist, which allow data to be shared. So it's about creating those mechanisms. A bigger one, cloning. I mean, certainly test tube babies. You remember that was a major issue for society 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now test tube babies still exist, but it took a long time to be accepted. And more recently, in recent years, it's been the issues of cloning, which have been, there's moratorium on that. And again, because you can do something in a test tube doesn't mean you should do it. And one of the reasons I'm not doing it is that the cell is very complex. A cell in a test tube and a petri dish that lives on plastic is not the same as a cell that's growing inside the body, where evolution is done. And there are diseases or states that are associated with these technologies, which are bad for the kids. So where do we how do we handle that? Well, I'm not going to get into cloning. That's not something for today. But I can tell you that in terms of data sharing, that's the place I had more experience. It was generally patients and families, especially for rare diseases and then cancer, where people really want to see progress. There is a big unmet medical need. We need progress. Any new technology may help. Stem cells may help. You need to, for Parkinson's disease, stem cells may help. For type 1 diabetes, stem cells may help. So after blocking kind of moratorium for a couple of years on what type of stem cell research could be done, there became some rules for allowing that research to happen. But it's driven by a pressing need, and then a need to actually develop a framework to doing things responsibly. So this is not about pharma companies. I'm just saying that some of the things we do in terms of technologies, certainly for someone who's healthy, someone who doesn't have the same concern as a parent, have a child with a disease, may think, hey, do I want this to happen in my society? Is it the right thing? Is it actually, it's not nature anymore, that we're actually using technologies to change things. So I think it's a societal dialogue that needs to happen. And then it's a question of finding the way, how can we improve the lives of some individuals, but also maintain some control over how it's happening.
The pandemic has turned people to science. I mean, we read more about science, we talk more about drugs, medicine, and vaccines, and so on. But at the same time, we have witnessed what seems like an increase in the numbers of the doubters, the naysayers, the conspiracy theorists. Is that a system failure, or is it to be expected? What is it? Could something be done to improve people's understanding of science?
Well, first, people I will fault here are scientists themselves. I don't think as a group we're very good communicators, or I think we shun. It's true. Maybe people like to be in the lab, have their lab coats and their gloves and stuff, but talking to family members, talk to people, what they do, what's the science, technology, sometimes it's a little difficult, but I think it's very important for people to understand, to be able to actually talk about science in an open way. And if you don't do it, when something comes out and people only hear it through a shock news, then of course they don't have any framework. So I think for understanding that information, and I often read papers, something in the article, and I just know it's hype, and so I think most people I get it that someone has taken a new finding. I remember once I was doing a radio show on genetics in Canada, and I get up, my newspaper in the morning was identification of the grumpy gene. I said, oh no. And I said, for sure. I walk to the radio station. My first question is on the grumpy gene. It's all types of associations that are done by research, and the fad diets and so on. It's hard to know where's the real science. In fact, one of the critical things of science is not even believing yourself in your own experiment. That's how it's through non-belief and actually questioning it. You continue to find seek new answers to difficult problems. It's constantly questioning yourself. So scientists don't know everything, but scientists have a methodology to identify things. But we need to talk about the methodology, what we do know, what we feel serious about, what we think is hype. There has to be some conversations. And I think as a collective, I think we're very poor at it. I think we don't try very hard on communicating with the public, and then of course something comes out that's big around vaccines, and again we just jump into the dialogue very very quickly, or a subgroup of people with very strong voice start speaking on behalf of scientists, and it's not science. So it's not always correct. So and again, when I start hearing a scientist who absolutely knows what the truth is, I start having my doubts right away because things are complex.
You as scientists you are trained in trial and error. You thrive through failure. You use failure. So I understand that it's kind of difficult to get in a conversation when people want like the absolute truth. Like when a scientist talks, he has to have in mind that people are expecting answers, as when a scientist does research is a whole different methodology, correct?
Yep.
So a science society, though, are communicating vessels. One cannot function in disconnect with the other. With technology playing a growing part in clinical research, how can countries, governments, universities, and societies in the public sector in general be part of innovation and benefit from the evolution of medicine and science? Especially we see it through, if we see this relationship, under the spectrum of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal to support the research and development of vaccines and medicine for communicable and non-communicable diseases in order to become as affordable as possible.
Listen, I'll start from the very high level because I did this in my previous world, but one of the human rights, that Helsinki Declaration of Human Rights is actually the right to innovate. That it is part of our human right to innovate. It's also a human right to access innovation. That if you develop something that's good for humanity, that everyone should access. These two goals sometimes are at odds with each other. If you create a piece of knowledge, you own it, but then you don't share with the rest of society, it becomes a problem. If you don't create a mechanism where innovation can happen, then there is no innovation. So it's important to find what's the right balance between supporting discovery, supporting innovation, and at the same time providing access. And I think even my company, my colleagues around the world, they're trying to make sure that because our scientists develop a new drug for a type of arthritis or inflammatory disease, we want to bring access to patients, and it's important to have those discussions. You're asking me where governments can play a role. Well, I think it's multiple stakeholders are needed in complex issues like that. You need the governments, which actually are there to protect the public, to help the public. I mean, they're supported by the public. You need the innovators and innovative companies. You also need the innovators in academia. And I talked this earlier. I think it's not possible for 1,000 or 10,000 scientists in a company to do all the discoveries in this very complex world that's moving very quickly. A lot of the innovation happens at universities and small companies. It's very important to be able to support them. I would say a government needs to be supporting health, needs to support education, but also needs to support research, support its researchers and scientists to do discovery. Governments have to help them connect. And I think in Europe, many of the initiatives of the EU actually have been connecting scientists for years, for several decades now, into projects and collectives. And very often it's very hard to have enough case of Crohn's disease in your own clinic or in your own country. But when you start actually pooling the information from collaborations across sites, you start having large numbers, and you can make a difference. So governments that are supporting networks, their scientists to participate is important. For me, as a company doing clinical trials, because we do have drugs, we care a lot about access to patients that have specific diseases, and in working the best clinical sites around the world. And so networking with those sites. So that means that there's some clinical enterprise within hospitals, within healthcare systems, which can be the interface between companies with new drugs, but also physicians supporting them to be able to recruit patients in trials. So there are a fair amount of resources and networks that actually can be supported. I'll stop there. Maybe I'm speaking a lot.
No, so what you are suggesting, I guess, is a tighter relationship between companies, academia, and the governments, like more regulated, more normalized relationships. So each wheel in the machine works to feed off each other and promote, of course, scientific development.
Well, I would put it in a different way. I think everyone has ideas. Physicians have ideas. They have theories, and if you link them with computers and database with other colleagues, those ideas that are good will be shared, will be debated, and sometimes they will becomes a source of a new program, of a new research project. So it's more about creating a connecting. Connections are so important in this innovation world, and you've seen it in social media. You've seen it what the internet has done. I think the same thing can happen in medical research, and it's but it's actually trying to get the brain power of more people through these types of collaborations are really important. And of course, there'll be some very strong innovators that are going to be in that very fertile world of connections and collaboration, and they'll make the difference. It's not all the discoveries are not going to happen in one lab somewhere in the US. It's gonna happen many different places, but you got to create that environment that allows innovation to flourish.
So Greece has tried to improve its framework, giving some incentives and trying to facilitate companies in hopes of attracting high-skilled investments. Some progress has been made. For example, apart from AbbVie's hub, recently Pfizer has started developing a digital hub in Thessaloniki. But there is undoubtedly room for improvement. Which do you think are the key ingredients for a successful R&D strategy?
I have experience because before coming to AbbVie, I did this 10 years in Canada. I built the Translation Institute for Cancer in Ontario, and worked with the minister. Was on the phone with him every couple of weeks. So I was one of his big investment was actually take the brain power we had in cancer research and turned it into innovation benefits for patients in terms of better services, but also IP and companies. Created 24 companies. Some of those companies, technology are being used in path labs, for example, and imaging labs around the world. And there it was a government that believed in innovation. It was that actually knew that you had to have several layers, from education to higher education to supporting its research community. But the other part, supporting startups was really, really critical. And I think that's where I saw where I will say one province in Canada versus others really decided to help an organization create those small companies, as opposed to letting the IP go somewhere else, is to start actually creating the companies there. And big companies will go anywhere around the world where there's innovation. Very often the small companies do type of experiments that you won't do in a university lab. It's more a validation experiment. You won't get a science or nature paper out of it, but it actually needs to be validated in a certain way. If you want to do it towards the clinical trials, you have to learn to manufacture some of the biologics or molecules to a higher levels of purity that you wouldn't do in an academic lab. So there's a place for that to happen. And I think that creating an early innovation ecosystem also needs supporting the small companies. Now, big companies like us will come and will go and network. So one thing we did a couple of years ago, as I said, we wanted to build up our networks around the world. I knew in oncology, Abby was not oncology, so when I joined, I had to explain all the time we were more than immunology, and we create connections. We have some scouts. They call it search and evaluation officers, but we have scouts in Europe, and they go to academic centers and they help identify innovation in universities. They work with tech transfer offices in universities. Very often they're supported with some government funds, because it's not just education when those money there, but they actually link innovators and intellectual property. They need to have funders, and they will connect to companies like ours. And then clinical trials. And now this is a place that we benefit, and we've set up a hub for clinical trial site management, monitoring in Greece. And again, there is we really want access. One of the most precious things in clinical development, clinical trials, is the patient. You can't do advances without having access to patients. And that means a level of support for clinical trials. When I was in Ontario, Canada, we went from about 3% of patients on a clinical trial to about 8%. Well, that was a bit of money, which it was government money, but we put at each of the major sites to actually have some nurses and some technicians collecting samples. And that became hubs to attract pharma companies and biotechs and others. So there's a bit of an infrastructure that's needed sometimes. It's not a big infrastructure to make these things happen, but companies like ours are really hungry for innovation, and we know we'll find it everywhere. We're also really eager to recruit patients. So where there's hospitals that are with clinicians really interested in participating in bringing innovation to patients, very often clinical trials are the right place. So these are places that I think are where, again, starting at that base is really important for growth of the industry.
So we have a question from the audience. Sorry. In your expertise, well, it seems that modern medicine is still divided between preventive and reactive medicine. The viewer is asking, why can't we make genome analysis a standard upon the birth of a child to see what diseases that particular organization, that particular child would be prone to?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to say, having worked more than 25 years in genomics, the interpretation of a genome is still very difficult. Most of the information of the 3 billions of A, C, Gs, and Ts, we still don't know what they mean. But there are some things we need, and very often, actually, it's been in pediatrics that the early cases of genome sequencing have turned out to be useful when patients have a particular syndrome, but you don't know what the actual disease is. Genetics and genome sequencing has helped us identify a couple thousand diseases, cause of disease in the last 10 years. So it's quite amazing, and that's very helpful for a kid. And so people have proposed, should we sequence every kid when they're born? And the reason is that for the very deleterious mutations, pediatric diseases that I'm thinking of, at least right now, you can very often identify these things in the genome. And early identification sometimes is an opportunity for treatment, or at least getting the proper care. Getting a good diagnosis is always a problem for kids. So there are places in the world which are proposing what the person has asked, that we sequence every genome. But on the other hand, it goes back to the fact that as a society, we're kind of wondering, what are we going to do with all that information? Because we still don't know how to use it. And I'm still of the voice that it would actually be very good to get millions of genomes and get information collected, and we should view it as a societal research project. And there must be some rules on when you find something and say, well, I'm going to go back to this person to say as higher risk for phlebitis or higher risk for another disease. So kind of the rules for return back of information are not quite known yet, but I think we can create mechanisms to do it. So in the context of consent, not every genome, some patients do not want concepts of consent, collecting information, making available to the physician and the patient. But when there's a new understanding that this gene might be predisposition to something that can be can be prevented, for example. That information would go back to the patient's file and for the physician and the patient to actually discuss. So there's more and more, we're going in that direction, but actually the whole framework is not all set up.
So in order to conclude, could you give us an idea on how the future would look like?
Well, I do believe the major things I see in the diseases, because I mostly work on diseases like lupus, inflammatory bowel disease, and cancer, is actually a much more precise information of the cause of a disease in one individual. Not on average, these patients have these type of mutations, but this individual has these mutations, and more drugs or therapies or treatment interventions which are specific to that disease, specific disease of the patient. That's happening in cancer a lot. You know, Herceptin was an example for the 15% of women which have that DNA abnormality. They take the Herceptin drug and it works. So we're seeing it a lot more, and I'm seeing in the research labs and the projects I'm doing that we're starting to break down some of these big diseases into subtypes. And I think it will be that more precise information for the right treatment. The unmet medical need continues. There are still diseases like pancreatic cancer, which we haven't done much progress. So I don't want to put any timelines on when we're going to solve every disease, but for more and more diseases, we are getting into the different subtypes of disease and treating people more specifically. And that's something that we see 10 years, 20 years from now will continue to happen in a very concrete way.
So I think if we don't have any more questions from the audience, we will conclude our conversation with Dr. Hudson. It was really interesting talking with you about the future of medicine, especially when the whole world is going through this pandemic and testing our resilience, both in ourselves and our families, but also the health systems and governments. And you most certainly gave us hope, because we talked a lot about collaboration as the way to go, and that is always a hopeful message. So I would like to thank you all and give the floor to Mr. Papadentriou, who will conclude today's discussion. And thank you again all. Dr. Hudson, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, hello again. On behalf of the Corporate Responsibility Committee, I would like to extend a big thank you to Dr. Hudson for enlightening us on your work, sir, and on genomics. The quality of life that we all have depends on work such as this. Well, it might be that the R&D people are not very comfortable in communicating, but Dr. Hudson certainly knows how to pass the message. Thank you, Mrs. Aguirre, for the excellent flow discussion. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed another session of the Sustainable Talks series. We look at linking sustainability with business, and we're trying to show that sustainability and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they're not a sideshow. They are part of our core business. And we heard great examples today. We saw the link between societal needs and pharma research. I think the most fascinating issue we heard today is the collaboration among companies that are commercially competitive to each other, collaboration for common purpose, for the common good, which is precisely the spirit of sustainability. In closing, I've got to say that we have more good things ahead. We have the annual CR conference coming up on Monday, October 19th. We will talk about tribes and purpose-driven business, and I hope you'll join us for this event. And I wish you a wonderful night. Thank you very much for being with us.